On the online study guide number 1, Harrison kicked a kickball off the roof of the gymnasium. This function represents the height and feet of the kickball above ground after 3 seconds. How long does it take for the kickball to hit the ground? Round your answer to the nearest hundredth. I will say that on the actual test, it's going to be not multiple choice. It's going to be like when you type in your answers. But anyway, if I want to know when the kickball will hit the ground, and there are 2 variables, we have height and time. What do I need to plug in and where do I need to plug it in? Find when the kickball hits the ground. Okay, it will be one of the x-intercepts. There will be 2 because usually there's 2, but we want to know the one after it's already been hit. So you could graph this and look at the answer, but say you were solving it algebraically, because like on your constructed response, you have to show your reasoning. So you have something really similar on your constructed response about this. What would I need to plug in? And what would I plug in? If I want to know when the kickball hits the ground, what's true at this x-intercept for one of the values? X-intercept by definition is when what happens? When y is 0. Good. So the y-axis would be height. The x-axis would be time, because time is almost always on the x-axis. I want to know when the h is going to be 0. And then because of that, then I have something that I could use, maybe quadratic formula I'd recommend. When you do that on your constructed response, you'll have something really similar to that. But also, since you will have graphing technology, we're not taking that away from you. You could also just type in and just look. So do what would save you the most time and be the most accurate. But of course, like you have to remember to change the t's to x's. So negative 16x squared plus 45x plus 24. Okay, you would have to remember to change the t's to x's and to know where to look. So this x-intercept doesn't make sense. If you solve by quadratic formula and you get 2 answers, most of the time, one of them will not make sense. You can't have negative time. But the other one, which makes more sense for like after it's been picked, does make sense. And for me, it's 3.271. If I need to round to the nearest 100, is it this one? Oh, it's 3, right? 3.271. On your test tomorrow, like I said, you'll have to type it in. It should be really clear what the answer is. If you follow that same procedure of typing it into Desmos, looking at the x-intercept, that would make sense. I don't anticipate needing to go back and really check that people typed it in right. Like it's really hard to mess that up. Yes? Yeah. But questions on this question? What if it wanted, or just side note, because again, it's also under constructed response, really similar. If it said, how long does it take for it to reach 20 feet? Then you're changing the h to 20. You are canceling it out by, your inverse operation, setting it equal to 0, and then solving that. But there's no, for this one, if you want to know when it hits the ground, the height would have to be 0. All right, other questions from any part? Willie? Okay, one on the constructed response. We have to solve this equation, x squared minus 3x equals 0, may rewrote the equation as x times the difference of x and 3 equals 0. Explain how rewriting this equation in factor form enables May to solve the equation. Algebraically, like here, you could probably graph it and I guess solve it, but that's not what it's asking. They want to know why does rewriting it into factor form help them solve it? So what would you say? Why is this now easier to solve? Versus this? Yeah. Like reduce, x and 3, is that what you mean? Okay, well, since I don't know what x is, and I can't like plug into that, basically when it's in standard form and I have the x squared and the x term, I can't just isolate x, like I can't just do the opposite and isolate it. I also can't really factor it because I'm missing a part, like it's just a lot harder when it's in standard form compared to factor form. Look at what it's equal to. And then factors, what do we do with factors? What could I do when it's set up like this? I could distribute, of course, that would again make it harder to solve and put me back to what I had originally. But factors are what we multiply. Like I could distribute, which is multiplying, and I'm multiplying and I'm getting 0. So what does that mean about one of my factors if my answer is 0? One of them has to be 0, and it could be either one. So this is a factor, the x, because it's being times by the parentheses. And then the parentheses is a factor. The way that you solve it by factoring is you set it equal to 0, which it already is. You set each factor equal to 0 and figure out what x has to be to make that factor 0. So for the first one, it's easy because it just has to be 0 to be 0. There's no isolating I need to do. It's already isolated. For the other one, what minus 3 gives me 0? Or if that's not clear, then isolate it with opposite of subtracting 3. And whatever you do on one side. So then x would have to be 3 then. It could be either one, because when you plug it in, 0 times negative 3 is 0, or 3 times 0 is 0. That's how I get my 2 answers. But you need to explain that. So you could say something about May can apply the 0 product property. Which says property, which says that if I multiply to get 0, one of my factors. And then you can even probably elaborate further to actually solve it by factoring, figure out what x has to be to make that factor 0. And so it goes in that conclusion. You can include the work shown to also explain, but you need to say something about how now you can apply the 0 product property. Yes. Yes. Questions on that? But you wanted more, right? Like the rest of it? Okay. So for part B of this, it says solve 2x squared equals 8x by rewriting the equation. So kind of like we did up here. Rewrite it into factor form. So 2x squared equals 8x. If I want to solve by factor form, I need it to be equal to 0. Otherwise, like there's lots of things that can multiply to give me 8x or whatever. I want it to be 0. So how can I make that 8x become 0? You can subtract it, whatever you do on one side of the equal sign. And now on the left side, these are not like terms. It's an x squared and an x to the first power, so I can't combine them. I'm just rewriting it. Notice that like you can't just do 2x² plus 8x, like you have to cancel it out in order to move it to the same side. And now to solve it like how May did in the first one, you can even look back to it. May factor by GCF. So there is a GCF between the numbers. What's the GCF between 2 and 8? Good. 2 divides evenly into both. Your GCF can never be bigger than your smallest number either. So if your smaller number divides into both. And then do they both have an X? So if you think back to that lesson, we take out whatever like the smaller amount of x's is. So not the x squared, the x for the first power. So my GCF is 2x. That will be outside parentheses, right? Like when you find your GCF, put it outside parentheses. Inside parentheses is what you get from dividing each term by your GCF. So when you have the same thing on top and bottom of a fraction, it will cancel. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. X squared divided by x, what do I get? No. X squared divided by x. Your calculator will not do that for you. So if x times x is x squared, then x squared divided by x is I know a lot of time on this problem, so I mean, I'm not gonna tell you. Factoring is supposed to be like the opposite of distributing. So what I should be able to do is when I multiply what's outside my parentheses by what we get inside, I should get my original. So what times 2x will give me 2x squared? Well, that, okay, no, not 1x squared. That's all. X times x is x squared, then x squared divided by x is x. And really, you should be able to do all your exponent rules. We are only really focusing on up to the second power, which is like insanely easy, like, I don't know, definitely memorize the whole setup so that you can try to apply it tomorrow. That's like me asking you what 1%. You guys need to know, x times x is x squared divided by x is x. Anyway, over here, x over x cancels. What's negative 8 divided by 2? Positive or negative? So this is me rewriting this into factor form so that I can solve it by zero product problem. If I were to distribute 2x times x is 2x squared, 2x times negative 4 is negative 8x. So it's just me rewriting it. Now that it is in factor form, I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. So factors are things we multiply. We normally multiply 2x by this parentheses, so we're gonna have 2x equal 0. And then we're gonna have this parentheses equal to 0. It could be either factor that equals 0, it could be the product of 0. So what times 2 would give me 0? Okay, so x has to be 0 here. If that wasn't clear, divide 2 on both sides, 0 divided by 2 is 0. Over here, what minus 4 equals 0? So it said, solve this by rewriting. Here's us rewriting it. Here's us solving it. Memorize it. It's pretty concerned. All right, last part of number 1. Explain why dividing each side of 2x squared equals 8x by 2x is not a reliable way to solve the equation. So let's see what happens when we do that. Because really, we've mentioned before that you could do whatever you want, as long as you do it to both sides of the equation, they'll still be equal. But let's see what happens when we do divide both sides by 2x. On the left side, the 2's cancel. What's x squared divided by x? Good. Over here, these x's cancel. What's 8 divided by 2? So it gives me this part, which we solved in the previous problem. What's wrong with solving it the way that we just did? Am I getting the other answer that we talked about? So that's basically why. So you could say, you could show your work, and you could say this is not a reliable way to solve because we only get one of the answers. So this is not reliable because we only get one solution when there are 2 solutions. I always post the key to the constructed response practice test online, because there's no other way for you to see if you're right. Otherwise, definitely go make sure that you are right and that you know how to do it when it's different numbers. Just apply the same steps that you did. Questions? Okay, questions on any other part? Either study guide, anything that's confusing now, or that you're having to cheat to get the answer, definitely want to make sure that you know how to do it. Yes. Okay, number 3 on the constructed response. So that's the one that I said was kind of similar to number 1 on your illuminate portion. The way you solve them would be pretty similar. So a community theater uses this function to model the profit in dollars expected in a weekend when the tickets to a comedy show are priced at $D each. So really pay attention to our 2 variables. P of V stands for what? And the 2 things being compared, what's the output? P of V. Well, it is my y, so whatever it is will go on the y-axis. But what's being compared? Profit, specifically. Because D is what? Profit is also in dollars, so be more specific. Dollars that we read it. Because profit is also dollars as well, so that wouldn't help me. D stands for louder. Okay, good. Because they're both technically in dollars. So the output, what should go on my Y is profit. The input, what's independent, is the ticket cost, right? Because the profit would depend on how much the tickets cost. If you look at how this is set up, since the A, the number in front of the x squared is negative, we know it'll open downward. So I can expect 2 x-intercepts. If one of them is negative, obviously don't include that one. We wouldn't charge a negative amount for tickets. You would not charge a negative amount for tickets. But it's possible both of these answers might make sense. You just have to see what they are. So you could graph it and confirm your answer by graphing, but for the first part, it says write and solve an equation. If you don't do that, you'll lose points. Don't write and solve an equation. To find the prices at which the theater would earn $0 in profit from the comedy show each weekend. And then you need to show your reasoning. So I need to make an equation regardless of if you use Desmos to find your answer. You need to make an equation. So here's the given equation. If I want to know when my profit is 0, where do I need to put that 0? Do I put it for the P of B or just the B? So we want to know when the tickets cost $0. The B is ticket cost. Did it say we want to know when the tickets will cost $0? Did it say that? It wants to know when what is 0. So we need to plug it in to P of D, like as a whole. We want to know when the profit is 0. Make sense? Yes. You don't want to plug it in for D because that would figure out when the tickets cost $0, how much profit you make. Like negative 100, and that would make sense. Okay, so plug in 0 for the profit. Then you can use any of the 3 methods we talked about to solve. Just if you have to show your reasoning, don't do graph. I mean, if you can't do it any other way, then you could try to go in one. So what method do you think would be easiest? Factoring, completing a square, or quadratic formula? Okay. While you probably could, I'd go against it just because these numbers are too big. Like, do you really want to find what multiplies to, I don't know, 4,000 and adds to 395? You could, but I wouldn't recommend it. Do you guys like completing the square? That one has a lot of steps. I don't know if you remember them all, but you could try completing the square. I would do quadratic formula, especially because that's the one that I'm providing you that I said you don't have to memorize. Here's that formula. That's the only one I'm providing you. So during the test, it will be on the screen. So remember, for this problem, I would recommend quadratic formula. For that, you need to identify your A, B, and C. So table 8, what's my A gonna be in this? What would be considered my A? So writer goes and each of dot, what would be considered my A is the question. -5 is correct. Table 9, what would be considered my B? The number is in the B position. You guys have no clue what I'm talking about, then make sure you have this memorized by tomorrow. And it's in standard form set equal to 0, B is always in front of what would be your X term. So what is my B? $3.95 then. Table 1, what's my C going to be? Good. Definitely, common mistake is people will forget to include the negative. You always keep the sign that's in front of each term. Normally, you put it right, plus 395 for the B, because it's pretty obvious. If it doesn't have it, then it's positive. But A and C are both negative, you need to show that. Then plug it into your formula. That could be your reasoning. So negative 395 plus or minus square root of 395 squared minus 4 times -5 times -800 all over 2 times -5. This alone could be your reasoning. If I see that you plugged it in the right way, that could be your reasoning alone. Some of it I'll usually simplify before putting in my calculator, although you could put all of this in your calculator if you want. But it becomes negative 395. Plus or minus, I would put whatever's under the square root in the calculator. I wouldn't even try simplifying that myself. And then for the denominator, 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. So now we're putting what's under the square root in the calculator. So I have 395 squared minus 4 times negative 5 times negative 800. Make sure you use parentheses. That is so important. Anytime you put something in parentheses, it gives me that big number, which if I go to check if that's a perfect square, all right, it's not a perfect square. So to avoid my having to do negative 395 plus this number, then divided by negative 10, what I would do is I, at this step, would put this in my calculator. The whole thing, almost. I would do the fraction bar on the top, negative 395, plus the square root of that big number. Over negative 10. And that gives me one of the answers. Is it possible to have a ticket cost $2.08? I don't see why not. It's not like it's negative. We wouldn't have any negative ticket prices. So I would include that. The other answer comes from changing this plus to a minus. Because remember, it was plus or minus right here. I can break it into two separate problems. So then change that plus in front of the square root to a minus. And that's the other answer. Both of them make sense. The other answer would be that the ticket cost $76.92. If we're talking about money, then I'm rounding the 2 decimal spots. Questions on that? Okay. Last part of number 3 under constructed response, it says, would the theater make a profit if they sold their tickets at a price of $48 each? So do I plug in that 48 for the P of D or just the D? Are they asking me to figure out when the profit is 48 or when the price of the ticket is 48? One, two, three. So plug it into D only. So it says what is the profit. So the profit is what's unknown. The ticket cost is what D was, so you have to know what your variables are. So anywhere that there was a D, I'm plugging in. And then I'll plug it into my calculator. But this could be your work shown, just you showing me that you plugged it into the equation. And then you can let your calculator do the rest. So negative 5 times 48 squared plus 395 times 48. So is it possible to have a profit of about $6,000? Is that a reasonable amount? Like it's not negative, right? So then you would say, yes, it would make a profit because it's not 0 and it's not negative. And you would say the profit is 6,600 points. That's a profit. Questions, comments, concerns? Right, might have time for one more, depending on what it is. But it's a lot, it's a tough thing, otherwise you'll have to figure it out on your own, or, me before the next month. Fine. So we did almost the entire constructed response, so a lot of you didn't have it done when I first asked for it. You would need to upload to Schoology to get more points than what it was when I checked it. Like I said, if you don't ask, and I guess we just never know, so while